Hello. I'm a couple of minutes late because a bunch of weird things are happening. You wouldn't believe what my computer looks like right now. It is just full of stuff that it's doing. I'm trying to set up to sort of deal with some of these things. And what I need to do first... Oh, there's the phone going off. What I need to do first is comply with what this thing is telling me to do. Oh no, there's more steps to follow. Okay, I'll get your chat up anyway. People don't usually have the chat going immediately. So there's nothing much I can do about that. This moves, hang on a second. Wouldn't it be funny if you could watch what I was typing? I'll be able to see whether that's true on the playback later. What? Okay. This is terms and conditions. Got all this crap going on. Oh no, please stop giving me things. Yeah, I'm going to have chat up in a moment. I'll tell you why all of this is kind of chaotic. Oh, I like that. I'm being told things like analytics and stuff, and it's like, do you want to share data with Apple? Well, I tell you, I have a story for you about data. It's having me set up all of this crap that I don't really... Oh, no. Oh, no, everything's going insane. Excuse me. I think this crap is going to just have to sit around. Look, enter all these passwords to do things. Like, I've had this for a while, and it doesn't run things, and this is my mom's old phone. It still is kind of old, but it'll run Instagram, so I'll be able to like do Instagram posts of things that I'm building, like these kinds of things, which is what I want to do. So this is my tool to doing it, but unfortunately, it is super... Oh, I just cancel everything. I cancel all these things. Oh my, okay. Guys, this is driving me insane. In particular, I loathe the idea of like, oh yeah, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to... Here, you shut up. You shut up and shut off now. No, you shut off. Be done. Be finished. There. You can charge, but don't bother me anymore. Hi. Oh, the madness. So I'm going to have to crank all of this stuff back up again and spend who knows how many hours dealing with it. But that is not for right now. Because right now I'm doing my live streaming. And although it's just a few of you, this is what I am here doing. See, and it claims to be music live streaming. That's a lie. I'm not making music. No, wait, I am. La 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 la. No, that doesn't count. So here I am firing up Creator Studio. I'll also tell you why I'm so tired and frazzled, but it is not bad things so much. But I do feel that I can get over to more of my usual streams for like answering questions for people and helping them do things. And what I got to do, my God, lots of chat. It could be set to the live chat unless people start misbehaving like crazy. And I do want to change this title to Q and A because that's what this is. But soon I'll be able to actually talk to you. Yay. And I think it just installed that. So what I need to do now is pep out chat, change it to a new size. Put it somewhere I can basically hear it. And hide this stupid thing, otherwise I'll look at my cell phone screen, which is not a rewarding sight. Oh my goodness. Yeah, but I'll even have to scroll back to even see what's going on. So I got GitHub up, and I've been having a bunch of interesting ideas and traveling with my computer programmer brother who can tell you how to do things. And I need to fuss with OBS a little bit first, because you're live on, yay! You're live on Top Chat. And I'm kind of staring into a bright light. You know what? Give me a second. These are my video shooting lights. Oh. The video shooting lights are going off. Also, my answering machine is lighting up brightly orange and blinking at me and all that kind of crap, because I'm getting harassed by the Google scammers again. And my eyes are brightly showing the windows which are illuminating everything. Guys, you're just going to have to deal with things as they are this time around. Me. Which is what the fellow that inspired my plugin for Sunday set would say is, me. I can make a plugin that makes me understand how awesome you are, and you're so awesome. So yeah, I need to sit on this side of the camera to be visible, and flip that over, and boop. So, computer musician posts a triangle with blue feet. Cool. I don't know what that means. Hi Bernard Hypo says music live streaming again. Yeah, I noticed. How's it going? And I do have hopes for this being a nice phone. It's been a complicated procedure. Pure Squish, yeah, Pure Squish is good. It is the capacitor of Airmodus compressors. Old 4S, new iPhone 6S, I believe. Yep, so it's about 2 generations old, but then it's about 2 generations newer than the 4S, and the 4S doesn't do some of the things that I'd like to do for Air Windows. I'd like to be able to upload pictures of things in a convenient way. You know, using social media the way social media wants you to social media. And hopefully that's going to work out. Critical Thought, hey there, how's it going? And, oh yes, I'm a flirt. Well, you guys are awesome. Put it this way, you're awesome because you were able to engage with a mode of doing business from somebody who is like a rampant lefty commie socialist bugger, and let me continue to survive in a system that does not have a space for that. Like, there is no space, in my opinion, for business people who will I don't know, treat customers nice. I don't know how to describe it. I was driving with my brother, my computer programmer brother, and we had a number of very interesting conversations. One of them is this. Here is this, he's a little younger than me, so he's not a young guy, but here is this corporate computer programmer guy who programs for accountancy. And because he likes to program, so he's like, hey, if you like to program and you don't care what you program on, the world is your oyster and you get all the money ever, because that is true. If you can do that and you don't mind just programming the boring, complicated stuff, there is endless demand for that, so he does quite well. But he was talking about things like the tendency of the world as it is today to go like, oh, everybody needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and take care of themselves by learning to code. And he's like, some people can't learn to code. Or, you know, to him, everybody's dumb. To some people are dumb and aren't going to be able to learn to code. And there are going to be human beings out there that can't do that. And what are they supposed to do? We had a whole conversation about the precariat. The precariat, of course, being, I think there's probably lots of my fans in the precariat, and I have all the sympathy in the world if it wasn't for Air Windows, which gives me roughly the same amount of livelihood. I would end up being in exactly that situation. And I'm explaining to Dan how you have to, you must have a cell phone to work at McDonald's. Well, not necessarily McDonald's, but I'm using them as an example. You must have a cell phone to work at McDonald's because they will call you that morning and tell you whether you have work that day. And so people end up being on call much as if they were brain surgeons, but to flip burgers. And then there are many machines. What am I hearing? I'm hearing a truck out in the street. I knew I was hearing something. Everything's all crazy. So increasingly we're getting into a zone where you have to be on call like a brain surgeon in order to go and flip burgers with machines that make it set up so that with the least possible instruction you can flip the burgers, which means you are increasingly disposable so they can really treat human beings as like a cloud resource. Like, haul some of the human beings in, have them flip the burgers during these hours because it predicts that we're going to get this rush because the AI is calculating how many people we need for given hours of the day, and then send them home again and really do not pay much attention to whether any given one of those people is surviving because that's not your concern. Instead, you are treating them as a cloud service, and it's sketchy. So what I should do, and so he was making arguments like he understood this stuff, which is interesting and I think enlightening because this is a guy that isn't really predisposed to understand the concerns of the precariat, and yet it was making a kind of sense to him that existed. And since he is this like nerdly computer programmer who doesn't think about things besides code very much, he has this very naive morality. It's like a kid morality where you haven't spent lots of time thinking about, like, is this fair? Is this just? Instead, you're thinking about, like, can I solve this code problem for my boss? And, can I pay my rent? And by the time he's solving the code problem, he's got that taken care of, so he doesn't have to think about that anymore. So rather than go on more about that, let me have a look at some of these questions, because there are Air Windows plugins questions, and this is the primary function of what I'm here for. And I have good news for those of you who are talking about this topic of conversation, the bus colors and stuff. So yeah, thank you for being concerned about my phones. I'm sure I'll get through now because I had to do more cleaning of my mom's house, which is going to be sold. And in doing so, I was able to get other passwords, including the password for my mom's old iCloud account. After I've answered some of these questions, I'll talk a little bit about my experience with Apple ID and the way Apple handles their ecosystem, which is interesting, and I'm drawing some conclusions from it. So I'm pleased with the choices and the way this is unfolding, but there are some gotchas that you have to be careful for because they also protect you in the long run. Different combinations of bus colors, says Prod Rambo. Want to have an analog setup in the box. One kind of dither worked best in Studio 10 VHD. Which TPDF would you recommend to use for stereo bus purpose? Well, that's an interesting question because if you're asking that question, you're already thinking in terms of doing other things besides simply using a generic TPDF dither. I make a generic TPDF dither. It's even slightly unusual because the way the random sources do their thing, the TPDF dither that I make does the dithering quite accurately, but it'll average out to half of a least significant bit of DC offset. And what that does is it means that the dither noise floor occupies 3 different positions as a noise floor without being any louder, rather than 2 positions as a noise floor. And what that does is it means you have slightly more granularity on how the super low-level stuff is going to be represented. And half of a least significant bit is not enough of an offset to break or hurt anything. It only upsets people who do their measurements and they're like, why is this producing an offset? Back in the day, Bob Olson, the mastering engineer, who is also a big dither fan and big dither supporter, in his listening tests on his very good speakers, he was like, I like the sound of your dither, but I want to know why that is because it shouldn't be any different. And now I figured that out. The sound of my dither sounds better to Bob because it's occupying 3 positions, and it does that because it has half of a bit of DC offset. And it has that because it's coded that way, so that's what it does. I came up with a way of upgrading TPDF dither. Who knew? But the other TPDF dithers, like tape dither and stuff like that, anything that is using the concept of 2 different random sources or a random source followed by a delay on it or something, all of those will work equally well. All of those will basically do the same thing. You can use Paul Dither, and Paul Dither is technically not invented by Paul Frindle. Me and Paul Frindle got into a fight over dither, and that makes me sad. But it is a high-pass dither. It is a generating 1 random source and then saving it and subtracting it the very next sample. So basically that one is going to be brighter, but also somewhat quieter. Essentially, if I would recommend a TPDF, it's a question of what you want out of it. Do you want, formally the most accurately type 1? In that case, maybe you don't even want TPDF. Maybe you want, not just another dither out of Studio Tan, as you say, because that'll be the highest audio performance, I think, that I currently give. If you want literally TPDF for other reasons, then you got to pick one, or just use the standalone one. I think is probably the best call. Somebody, possibly you, were asking me oh, it seems as if that is different from the one in Ditherbox. Well, bear in mind Ditherbox is older. I would preferentially go with the standalone dithers. Partly simply because they just used less resources. They don't have a switch in it. There's less to go wrong. It's simpler. And Ditherbox was when I was putting one of your big switchy I'd sort of oscillate between doing the standalone things and optimizing them and making those crowd-pleasing, oh, here, select from a dozen of these things, even if I don't think maybe that you should. So, that's my recommendation. Ask me again, or ask me in more detail if you need more. The analog setup in the box and console 5 specifically, and you can, if you want to update that even more, what you could do is use, I think it's raw console 5. I'm looking right at the GitHub so I can find out. Oh, I'll quickly also answer, if you're using desk is just a tone coloring thing. It could go on channels, it could go on the bus, it could go pre or post the console bus plugin. It's up to you. If you place things inside console, meaning between the 2 plugins, the things will have more of an effect, more of a striking effect, and will be manipulated kind of the same. I've got this super fan, David Pixley, who shows up sometimes. He might even show up today. And he's really into ULaw. And ULaw is a pre-post processing plugin where you adapt stuff with ULaw and then you unadapt it and get the original thing back, but much more extreme. And console is kind of like that. If you do effects in between the 2 plugins, they have a more striking effect, which might be good and might be not. In some cases, like doing delay effects, it's great putting stuff inside there. But you mostly want to keep unity gain between the 2. So putting a gain trim in between the 2 is kind of useless. So I'm going to touch on Bo's question first. And I don't use FFT in my stuff, but I can tell you what it is. And not only that, give me a second, I'll grab paper. I was not very well prepared today. I was slow off the mark, and hopefully I'm actually recording the right things. Oh, and I'll also tell you why my music live stream didn't go to SoundCloud. hopefully everything settles down to the point where I can get this stuff to make sense again. So now I have a pen and paper, and I'm going to write FFT on it because that's the next thing that I'll talk about. I'll explain that. But, yeah, the reason things are a little chaotic is that things are a little chaotic. And the reason there's no SoundCloud of my jam last week is because I have taken, and I'm reminding myself of it now, I have taken to doing a local capture of our, like, my mic input on our talk live streams, because it's the time when I'm doing this talking into my little headset microphone. My paper and pens are good enough for this. I'm recording it because once I get caught up in talking to people, I forget I'm recording. And so, actually, I have access to a chalkboard, but it's my mom's old address note board by the telephone and stuff. So I could, but it would be cumbersome to hold up. Anyways. What the heck was I saying? Oh yeah, I was saying that what killed the SoundCloud version of the jam last week, which I thought went terribly when I was doing it, but then I listened back and I was like, this isn't that bad. I know why it's going wrong. I'm recording that microphone, and then once I've forgotten that I'm recording it, I'm not paying attention to my volume, so I'm blowing up the distortion sometimes, which is fine. I don't care. But I'm also getting a bunch of candid audio. I'm getting audio where I'm talking to the stream. I'm looking at chat and talking to the stream, and when I forget, oh God, and now it says top chat. I actually don't want that unless it's necessary. Let's switch it to live chat. I'll scroll up a little bit and see if I've got any. No, I think pretty much everything showed up. If any of you guys are getting blanked out with the top chat, I'll fix that unless anybody's coming. It's just trolling really obtrusively. So I did my entire streaming, and I was running the mixing board and sending the analog inputs through to YouTube, and it was getting the line ins as it's supposed to. And I was capturing 24-bit 96K audio of this microphone. And I wasn't wearing the headphones, and the microphone was like over here between the speakers, so I had a 2-hour-long 96K 2+ gigabyte capture of a dumb little headset mic. And I was so mad. I was so frustrated. I made a little note for myself saying, Twisted Wave, mic for chat, line 96K for music, so that hopefully I remember next time. And I don't do that again because it was super annoying. And that's why the SoundCloud didn't happen, is because there wasn't anything for it to have. The SoundCloud is specifically for being able to put up the high res of that, the direct capture of that stuff. But the reason I'm capturing the chats, and usually I'll end up forgetting that I'm doing that, and 15 minutes later I'll notice, oh, it's still on and recording. What does it do? Oh, I remember. Is that I'll get large amounts of casual, candid audio from a super close microphone next to my face. And maybe I can end up including it in the modular synthesizer stuff. Like, if you have to have voices plopped onto things, I'll take samples. And it'll be a really high quality sample rather than a bad quality sample. Reasonably high quality. It'd be like 44.1K, but I can have uncompressed, un-MP3'd samples. And just, if I'm saying anything particularly interesting or anything dramatic or anything that is weird out of context, I can make a track or a jam out of that and start using that in the jam. And then, you'll have my voice popping through the music and stuttering and doing whatever else it does. So yeah, before this scrolls away too far, I have got a question about FFT. And you're onto something there. Here's what's going on. FFT is a mathematical technique for making a series of bands. It's like a 31 band EQ, only it's 4096 or 1024 or something like that. Like your bands of EQ are just like this. This is how close together they are. They're just pff. And then you can take those bands of EQ and treat them like a graphic EQ. Like you'll have some like this here, or say you've got other ones and you're not reconstructing anything below this point, so these are just zeros. And then you're telling this one like these are quieter. You reconstruct it and you have the output of that EQ. I think that this does generate phase issues. I've never been very satisfied with the sound of extensive FFT processing. And I've done work with it because, back in the day, like practically before the PowerPC Macintosh, I think, Tom Irby's SoundHack existed, and Mac people might be familiar with it. And SoundHack is a thing where you can do stuff like it is spectral things. They call them spectral things. So you can take a audio thing that is like this, and then your background noise print looks like this, because it's got some like low frequency noise in there, and then there's a 60 cycle hum, and maybe you've got its over harmonic there, and then it's a little quieter, and then it's hissing a little bit, so the noise frequencies are like this over to the top. And you can take this sound print and do a spectral filtering, a spectral gate, where you take your audio while music is playing through it, and every one of these channels, every one of these millions of bands, is looking for, am I quieter than this noise point, or am I at this verge of this noise point? You'd make a small boost over the threshold, which means that if you have a noise print like this, and we're talking now about like audio restoration type stuff here. If you have a noise print like this, and your background, your music is going like this, but you have maybe music where it's just a note, and there isn't any content in here, the spectral thing can still filter out the noise in the lows if there isn't audio in the lows. If the audio is just here, this audio is happening and the noise underneath it is also going to come through, but it'll be able to filter out everything else. The trouble with this is that if you do it so extremely that you get really good filtration, that it like totally kills the background noise, it sounds like garbage. It sounds like bad cell phone warbling and stuff, because cell phones also use FFT. MP3s also use FFT. Some of the sound of listening to MP3s is the sound of listening to an FFT, like deconstruction and reconstruction. And how MP3 works is just like this. What they're doing is taking a limited number of bands, 1,000, 4,000, something like that, capturing all of those things and capturing what the amplitude is in whatever chunk of audio that you're using. And doing things like going, okay, we're only going to record information for one of these bins in this area because they will mask each other and then you won't be able to hear them. So we're going to pretend there's just one note, but we'll tell you which note it is. Lossy compression, MP3 does stuff like that. And even if you do good compression, you're still hearing FFT processing with a certain amount of alteration in the sound. So extreme noise reduction, or at least FFT noise reduction, frequency aware noise reduction rather than a simple gate, and lossy encoding and MP3 and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff has to do with FFT, fast Fourier transform conversion. And again, I have not used it on anything. And it's possible that I'll think of something to use it on, but there are people who have specialized in that, and I don't really like how the very process itself sounds, much less the things that are done with it. So I've never really bothered. I've never really bothered to learn how to do it. It might sound like I know, and I'm filling in the bare basics on it. Let me have a peek here and see whether I'm running out of things at all. And they are sharp filters, indeed. Critical thought. I'm going to quickly answer this and move on. I'm not isolating brass from skins. When I record drums, which is not often, and I'm hoping to start to do it more as I get more into, I'm going to be building more recording systems of various kinds. Like here, I have something to show you, which I think I should take this off. Hey, check this out. I got a computer. It's an antique iMac. It used to be my mom's before she got another computer, and then that one became an antique too. And her other computer looks kind of like my desktop, and so now I have various options. None of them are really anything like modern generation, and this one is super old, but I don't think it runs a PowerPC processor. And it is Apple has gotten to making things really thin. I guess I can see why, looking at how this worked out. But I might be able to make this into a digital audio workstation, just dedicated digital audio workstation, like Renoise or Reaper or something. Something that'll run on an older machine. So yeah, I'm not using that right now. And I'm not using the main one, right? Like all of my use of my very decent Mo 216A is either capturing stuff at high sample rate as a stereo track, or just listening to the output of my computers. Like I'm not using my computer's line output or whatever. I'm using it on these headphones now, but for actual critical work, never. It's always an external converter. Yeah, mine talks on Thunderbolt and has 16 tracks, and it'll do 192K, although I only stick to 96. So I am not isolating brass from skins. When I mic drums with as few microphones as possible because I like the sort of old Glyn Johns, not as many mics on the kit. I'm working on ways of doing like mics that are at about hips height on either side of the kit, and I'm finding some results through that, and I'll let you know more about that as it develops. And I'm also experimenting with either supplementing it with a microphone in the kick, or a microphone that is roughly at the same orientation, except for that it's in front rather than on the sides. And I haven't experimented with that yet, but I'm looking to see whether I can get some mileage out of that too. So that's basically the style there. Is I don't isolate brass from skins. I design my drum sounds for my actual drum kit, which you never hear because I'm doing synthesizer stuff, around room sounds. And that's the plain and simple answer to that. So, and as a result, I get sounds that are very convincingly retro. I could do a very good imitation of like classic rock or whatever. It's not necessarily popular these days, and everything comes in and goes out of popularity anyhow. And I've never been into the let's close mic everything drum kit. I have 16 channels of input. I don't have 16 preamplifiers, nor would I want or need them, because I wouldn't be wanting to capture that many things on the drum sounds that I like best are the ones that were a few or even one microphone. So, and generally it's not one, because then I lose the kick. So when people do record with just one microphone on the drums, generally I'm not happy with it, because miking got better when I'm trying to remember the name, Jeff McCormick, Jeff Emmerich, recording the Beatles, started putting a mic directly on the kick, and that started making a good rock mix type sound, being able to have drums, also a bass, maybe a DI bass or a bass that's recorded up close, and a kick that's recorded up close. And in that way, you wind up getting the, like the Tomorrow Never Knows bass and kick drum sound, because that's the first time he did it, and you can listen to that now and go, oh yeah, that's normal, but it didn't exist before then. They weren't doing that before then. And there are other alternatives, like I'm very in favor of the sound of the Jethro Tull album Aqualung. I'm a big fan, and there are things about that people would consider unacceptable now. Notably, it's one of those ones that's being recorded at a distance, and the drums sound like they're at a distance, and the drums get lost. There's a kick drum in those things, but you don't really hear it as a kick drum the way that we understand them, because even though it's 1971, it was not being recorded the way that Tomorrow Never Knows was mic'd. There is no spot mic on the kick drum that I'm aware of. Instead, it becomes sort of built in to the sound of the band, and the bass is also not terribly loud. It's just loud enough to work. And as a result, you can have this powerful, rather distant, the band hits like a symphony orchestra, but sharper. But it still blends and doesn't separate out into distinct parts because the things are more distantly mic'd. And I'm working on reproducing that. That is something that I want to put some time into experimenting with. And what else can one do with? Well, actually, no, that's a separate question. So I don't isolate brass from skins. I made that by request for Tim. What else can one do with brass red air? You're probably going to have to ask David Pixley if he shows up, because he's probably still playing with it, because it was like, this is useless, and he's like, aha, challenge. I don't usually do weird things with plugins. I like doing weird things with circuits. So there's that. Let's see now. I'm going to scroll down because I'm losing people's new comments. I'll get to you. I've always gotten to everybody that had something to say. What's an experiment? I don't know what an experimental room reverb track is, but you'll remind me. Transdesk, I can tell you exactly what Transdesk does. Transdesk does the same thing that TubeDesk does, and kind of the same thing that Desk does, but with different values. That's back in the day when I was doing a saturation effect. It's very much like Channel. It's like all the versions of Channel out there have many things in common with Desk, except for that Desk has a more sophisticated highs muting algorithm that is characteristic to all of the variations of it. So what it does is this slightly different high frequency limiting, or it's not really a limiter, it's a kind of clipper, a slightly more sophisticated slew clipper, and saturation, sine wave based saturation, and a high pass. And the thing that, well, actually, no, hang on. I'm talking nonsense here. Bear with me for a second. I'm back at home and with my coffee and stuff, so I'm going to drink a little coffee and think more clearly. Immediately, I hope, because I'm talking nonsense. I'll tell you what is really in Transdesk in a moment. So what's really in Transdesk is this. There is the saturation thing, which involves a high-frequency mute. And then what's in Transdesk and in TubeDesk and in Desk itself, and whatever version number, is the plugin PowerSag. PowerSag lives inside Transdesk. If you like the sound of Transdesk, specifically as it differs from Channel, you can isolate that by using PowerSag. For Transdesk, you'll be setting it to a very high frequency. I think it'll be sort of all over on the left, the frequency setting. And then you dial in as much of that effect as you want. And with those preset ones, it's not a very large amount. It's just enough to sort of color things a little bit. But that is a process where, give me that piece of paper, where it will take averages. Like here's a bunch of samples, and it'll do a thing like, okay, measure the average of these samples. So as you keep going, if you were playing back just this, it would be muted. It would be like the average plugin. But what Transdesk, TubeDesk, Regular Desk, PowerSag all do is they're keeping track of this, and then they're going to subtract it from the regular sound, leaning stuff out a little bit. So you get this moving average, but rather than giving you the output of that, instead it's using it as a subtraction. It's taking that away. So sort of more high frequencies and mid frequencies and stuff will come through. And the bigger you make it, by the time you get to tube desk, or by the time you get to turning up the desk frequency control really high, you have a very large average indeed. It's like taking the average of half a second of audio. And there's a way to do that which doesn't involve having to count all of the different bits. I think it also can produce problems when you change the frequency. So I might have code in there to help with that, because it can deliver those unintentional DC offsets if you're suddenly changing where the offset is. And that is, if you're talking about warm type of compression, that would basically be just one of my saturation routines. So many things will do that. But the transistor mixer-like sound is coming out of that power sag stage that I just told you about. And I have been asked to also incorporate a power sag that lets you boost the thing rather than cut it, which I think is a fine idea, although it won't really react like, power boost. Instead, it'll become just more like a smoother or softener. But it's worth trying out. I've got a couple of ideas for ways in which I could maybe make that better. And that's in the queue. I'll get to it. So I still don't know what the experimental... Oh, yeah. Yeah. The accidental mic recording could be a room reverb track that you don't get to have the direct audio on a bunch of synthesizers and stuff. So, yeah, I threw it away. It was not useful to me. Now, I'm still scrolling down, but I will catch up. I'm going to catch up really quick. So, an FFT is indeed a complete representation of a signal. It's like a vocoder. It's like a huge vocoder. If you have it granular enough, and you keep track of the different levels enough, then you can go through one. I think technically, if you had a long enough word length, and really handled it properly, you would be able to reconstruct it to something that was good. Like the actual making of the FFT bins doesn't break everything. So it's not literally like you run into an analog EQ that's 4,000 bands wide. It's one of those deconstruct, reconstruct things. I just have not generally been happy with how they worked, or with the results of taking isolated bands and doing stuff with them. Generally, I've been dissatisfied with what happens with the sound that way, and I think part of it is probably just the sheer amount of calculating involved. Because there are some nice little mathy shortcuts that they use. They use these things where it's like, okay, and you do this routine, and this routine, and this routine, voila, suddenly you have the bandwidth, all of the bins organized for you, and I don't really know how that stuff is done. It's on a level of programming that's a little over my head, which is not to say I'll never learn it, but I am saying that, yeah, it is intended to be a complete representation of a signal, and if it fails, it's probably because it has to do so much math in the course of doing it. Because one thing that'll happen is when programmers do this kind of stuff, you'll have something that's like, 10,000 math operations, and you got code, and it's like 10,000 lines of code, and programmers will tend to cringe at that. And they go, okay, no, this bit does this line of code, which calls this line of code, and then this line of code over and over again. And so you wind up with this thing where it's like, okay, much simpler, right? This was 10,000 lines of code, and this is 4. But these 4 lines of code are figuring out how to go, okay, in this line of code, we call this 5,000 times. In this line of code calls this line of code 32 times for each of its 5,000, and this line of code calls this twice, and it's in an entirely different place. So it makes it all shorter, but you're doing 20 or 30,000 lines of processing rather than the 10,000 you started with. They have this way of trying to boil stuff down into this poetic kind of context where it's like, it becomes haiku programming, make as few words as possible, and never mind whether it's so complicated that you have to be a guru to understand what's happening underneath the hood. All you get to see is the moving parts. But then if they're doing a really complicated thing, you've got to understand the complicated thing on top of what you were already intending to do. Because with this, 10,000 lines of code, you probably were intending to do something, And you still need to remember that you're doing something, but also need to remember that it's being done in this complicated way to have fewer words in the program. So it's interesting. People who have grappled with that concept are John Carmack of id Software and Doom and Quake and stuff, and Jonathan Blow, the indie game developer who did Braid, who went through a kind of enlightenment period where he started off going, oh, all this longhand stuff is terrible, everything should be like this. And then he decided, actually, no, this is needless complication. Doing it in longhand is good because then it's really obvious and you're not spending time thinking about keeping track of this on top of that. You're focusing on the key part. And that was Jonathan Blow's insight there. I'd love to meet that guy. I think it's a very good thing to go through those phases and go, yeah, I'm gonna appreciate the simplicity of long form, as it were. Anyways, Suffor has a question here, and I'm gonna need to scroll to catch up with things, otherwise I'll lose stuff. If possible, I am working in 96K, and if you're talking about render, here's the thing. Like, I'll capture in 96K for my music on Tuesdays. When it streams, the streaming program is already sampling that down to 44.1 and making an MP3 out of it effectively. So, that's fine. If I was making a CD, I would start from 96K and then use a sample rate converter. And I found that that one brick, there's a comparable one, which I don't remember the name of it, for PC, but the really old program Brick for the Mac, which would run in that old computer, does a nice job of doing that. You can set it to do a really slow, grueling version of processing it and then spit out extremely high resolution output. So I do like the downsampling rather than capturing directly at the lower sample rate, because you also get to keep the high sample rate version. And what you're talking about probably is use of plugins. And that's one of the reasons I try to support the 96K and up on all of my plugins, and I keep track of which ones might do weird things or not. I do think that working at high sample rate if you're working in the box is a good idea. I don't think you necessarily need to work much over 96K. You'll still get aliasing even working at something like 192K if you produce harmonics that high. It just sort of pushes them away a little farther. But yeah, there is no reason to be ashamed for working at high sample rate in the box. It's honestly a better way of doing it, especially if you're doing a lot of stuff with plugins. Yep. Yes, Fourier transfer is used in medicine and chemistry things. I don't know how it's done. I'll find out one day. Could I make a phaser out of it? No, but I can make a phaser out of phase nudge, because you make phasers out of all-pass filters. And I just haven't done it yet. And I tried a while back. It didn't really work out, but I'll revisit it. At some point, I'll make a phaser. Why are resonant EQ plugins so rare? I couldn't tell you. I thought you could get... I mean, how can you call them rare when you can get them in any DAW's default... Any DAW's default DSP cookbook EQ algorithm is going to give you the capacity of giving a peak filter and then sharpening the Q until it is essentially a resonant, because that's basically what that's about, is you're sharpening the Q of a filter. So I wouldn't call that rare. I would think that that was very common. If I'm misunderstanding, correct me. FFT detection path, yep. That's very useful for if the thing you're trying to detect is at one particular frequency. You can even throw out the excess stuff and just use that to narrow down on one particular band. And I've done ResiQ. That is coming. ResiQ is eventually coming. All ResiQ is a algorithm for generating a little sort of frequency pulse, like a resonant pulse, that starts off at a speed and then transfers to a different speed. So it's essentially what I'm considering like a emulation of a analog convolution impulse. Like you'd use it like a reverb. Like ResEQ is a way of generating on the fly a little convolution impulse that's basically just EQ. And I'm probably going to be able to improve it when I revisit it. Although it may be a good idea to put out what I had back in the day. But I've done resonant EQ stuff too. In that case, I was trying to design a way of generating a more analog style impulse response for the output of this EQ. And I did some measurements and I looked at some outputs and things. And I was like, it looks like it's doing this. Let me program a synthetic impulse output that does that. And so I did, and it worked out pretty good. Holt is a great resonant low pass, yes. I have no idea why anybody would want a high pass version of Holt, nor am I intending to do one. It makes no sense to me. Holt is such a low pass. It makes no sense as a high pass. It's kind of uncontrolled. If you say, you could use it by molding to two separate tracks and doing a phase flip on one of them and then combining them together, and that's about as good as I'd be able to get it. There is no way to make that make sense. I can't give you a high-pass version of Holt other than you rolling one of your own in the DAW, because it doesn't make sense. There's no way that I can tune it that finely. It's already rather difficult to manage. So, yeah, and the room recording... and we do have more questions, so I'm catching up, though. By all means, keep asking to make me work for this. This is my 2 hours of working for my user base, customer base, fan base, whatever you want to call it. Simple setups without any preamps. Do I have anything to say? You mean simulate. Some of the preamps I've got are so good that I wouldn't mind simulating them. The APIs, ooh, let me please those APIs. But as far as getting the sound of them, here's what I would tell you. You can't actually simulate what a preamp does because it's for amplifying microphones. If you want to simulate the sound of a particular one, that's what bus colors is for. Go and use bus colors for that. And I've talked before about which things they emulate, but I talk about my APIs, so I think Rock is the SSLE kind of one. Dark, I think, is the one that ended up being API, unless it was something else. I got the GitHub in front of me. Let me just go and look. I think it might say. See, now bus color is 4. If I go to the code, I should be able to look that up. Yep. So I'm reading the code right now. It's bus colors 4 CPP. And I've got the switch, and one of the reasons I don't like this rather than doing them in individual ones is because it's hugely cumbersome. It's 1 million lines of code. Well, not 1 million lines of code. It's more than 600 lines of code, so it's cumbersome to work with. But note this down. If you want to put the preamplifier colors on, use bus colors, and dark is like an MCI, and it's based on a focus rate impulse. Rock is based on an SSL impulse. Lush is based on a Neve, as everybody knows. I've got one for an LA2A. I forget what I called it, but I think I have it written down here somewhere. Yeah, Vibe. I guess I came up with that one, and Vibe is where I stuck in the LA2A impulse that I had kicking around. Holo is the a Precision 8, whatever that was. In any case, it made an impulse that was interesting audio-wise. API went to the name Punch. Steel, or whatever I called it, scrolling up for 1 million miles again. Yeah, Steel is, I don't even know what. It was some kind of funny piece of hardware. And then Tube comes from a manly massive passive. And that's actually the massive passive impulses. And I wasn't using the heavily equalized ones, but that's where I got the ideas for ResEQ. How I got the idea of synthesizing something that would work as a resonant EQ was looking at the impulses generated for convolution of a manly massive passive at extremely high resonance. There were some examples that were much more resonant filters than you'd get, to the extent that you can even do that with the massive passive. But it was producing stuff that had a characteristic look, and I went, okay, this is like sine-like, but it starts out faster and then it switches over. And so I used that. So, simulating a preamp, you do that. Do bus colors. I hope that I can afford clothes other than this robe. Maybe I'll get a king's robe. It'll be all royal blue and it'll have like trim and fluff on it and stuff. The robe is mostly because it's really cold in the winter. And I wear this to keep warm through the winter up here in Vermont. But in the summer, it's obviously going to be something else. Like, although honestly, the reason I initially bought it was because those Tuesday music streams, I was going to do a whole bit about the Tuesday music streams would be done with the synthesizers, and all you would see is guy in a hooded monk's robe and just manipulating this stuff. I was going to do that and never bothered. And then I discovered that the robe was so warm that it was just my clothes and kept me warm in the winter. And I've been really enjoying that. I never ended up using it as like the costume for the music streaming. Now in music stream, I use just regular day-to-day costume. No, I don't go out dressed like this. I think it'd be kind of awesome, but I get arrested. And I may very well end up getting like a Buddhist monk's robe that is very light linen and more white colored for summer when it's really hot and I'm still doing hours of streaming. Who can say? You know, I like it because it's also one of those things, you know, if you were a YouTuber or a plugin designer or certain kinds of musician or whatever, you can probably set up your life so that you can go through life in a bathrobe. You'll just be really poor. You know, there's trade-offs. Like you could live life in such a way where it's like, I just want to live in a bathrobe and spend a bunch of time thinking about stuff. And it's like, okay, if you work hard enough, you can have that about as easily as you can have like making a normal living and having the white picket fence and stuff. It's just that you'll be really poor. And you will always be under more strain, in more danger than normal people. But all these things can be done. It's just to, you know, choose wisely. Grasshopper. So, we're getting closer and closer to 1,500. Yay. Bernard says, wouldn't it be good for your channel and Patreon thing to alternate Mondays with the new idea? Analyze a minute from a classic hit. No. If I get up to 1,500, I give you more time. It may be that people will continue to have questions. Like I'm still trying to chase the scroll here. I'll give you more time. I'll spend 2 more hours if I get up to that amount because I'm exchanging my time and attention for getting paid, which is a normal kind of going to work thing. Like that's normally, it should make sense to people that that's how it works. I'm not trying to arrange for give me more money and I'll not spend any more time on you. Instead, I'll do this other thing and stop doing something that I was doing. And that's not how I fly. I'm not doing that. Instead, what I'm doing is offering to start doing a new thing. And you know, I mentioned that Phil. Phil is spelled F-I-L. And I've been watching some of his stuff more recently. He's doing this channel called Wings of Pegasus. And that kind of makes me feel like I'll be able to do the Wednesday analysis stream. Because what he's doing is he is taking all of these clips off of other YouTube. And they're in a little window and he's commenting on them. And often that's like classic hit type stuff that is being no doubt protected. But for whatever reason, like he's working like currently and getting away with it. And part of what he's doing is he is not playing the thing straight through. He will always stop it in the middle and go, you know, I'll just stop it here because, and then he'll go on this long monologue about usually how much he likes stuff. And that is why I think that probably more often than not, even if I start with the greatest hits, because I mean, Phil has covered the Eagles and stuff on his channel. He's covered some pretty big hits, and he's covered some people who protect their IP very carefully. And he's still putting up the videos. He might be losing some of them from time to time. But I really feel like I'd be able to do that, especially since I'm sourcing stuff from vinyl. And so it's not going to be the same pattern of bits quite as stuff literally off of a CD. It's going to be a little harder to recognize. There'll be some noise and stuff. You hear the little crackles and pops from time to time. But I feel as if I'm going to be able to do that, and I have promised that I will do that on Wednesdays at the same bat time, same bat channel. So yeah, no worry about alternating the Mondays. I am definitely adding Wednesday if I get there, and I would like to. I'm excited about that. Kind of the way that I feel about it is it makes sense to me to do up new Patreon tiers and stuff, and every step of the way it'll be doing more, but it's doing more stuff that I care about. Like, I'd like to do these analysis things. You've heard me talk about this stuff. I'm really into it. And I can treat it the same way, like, okay, it's Chris in his bathrobe, it's Chris in the monk robe, and that can just be more of the thing. That makes it very casual for me. It's not like I have to all get made up and turn on the TV lights and stuff, which I will do for the actual Air Wonders videos, because that's some people's only point of contact with seeing what I do. This is more casual. This is for like the super fans, as you get to sort of join me and hear me talk for 2 hours about what is interesting to me. Normally people won't tune into 2 hours for anything. So stuff gets to be more personal as it gets to be more focused in that way. So let's keep scrolling, because I'm losing people again, and I don't want to lose people. Yeah, Purist Drive will get you a good sound. I never insist upon, when people like, can I emulate this? I get really saucy with them. The poor guy who was wanting the 1950s studio was emailed me and was like, dude, I didn't say that I wanted to be like Elvis. I'm like, I'm sorry, but, and I'm like, you're asking for some of these specific things and continually asking me for like this and this and this and how accurate is it? And I never care. I don't care about whether something is accurate. I care about whether it's doing a sound that's useful. We're going into the future. So I'm much more interested, and that's one of the things I'll be doing on Wednesday. It'll be really exciting, because on Wednesday I'm going to cover everything. Like anything that I know about the attitudes of the musicians as they set up to record. Like if they did a particular thing, if they got into a football huddle and went, go. I'll tell you about that, because I'll assume that that's part of how they got that sound. The sound is not the gear. The sound is their attitudes going in. The sound is how they approach the microphone. Like, do they have microphone technique? How did they set up the amplifiers? How do they approach hitting the strings? Like there's stuff like, I think that one of the things AC/DC is noted for, and you wouldn't think this, and it might not be them I'm thinking of, but it might be, is you've got these guys who are getting incredibly heavy, powerful sounds. They're turning up incredibly loud, lots of gain, but that doesn't mean they're hitting the string super hard. They might be hitting the string super briskly. You have the pick or whatever, and then it's going, instead of going like scrub, grind, crunch, 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 it's a flick. It's like your hand is there, and then it's gone. And that hits all the strings really rapidly, but they might be hitting the strings really glancingly. And that is part of the stuff I would talk about. I'd be trying to interpret it. We'll do Dire Straits. I'll be like, here is where Mark Knopfler is using his fingers rather than a pick, because he's famous for doing that. But if you're not a guitar player, you don't necessarily know. You don't necessarily know that Stratocaster sound is a orange squeezer compressor and is going through, is being sounded by him with his fingers and thumb. And there's also, if you're doing that, you have to care about how long your fingernails are, because that's a big difference. All that kind of stuff. If we end up doing stuff like Van Halen's first album, it's going to be really interesting, because I'm going to be doing a historical deep dive on everything that I can find about how they set up those crazy sounds, because there's a lot. Like if we touch on Van Halen's first album, and I do believe I have that in the list, There's like the way he did the guitar sound, different ways of doing it, and there's AC/DC guitar sound stuff as well that the truth has eventually come out as to how they got some of those, Back in Black era tones. That is a case where you could talk about the specific gear and go like, okay, he used this wireless transmitter which compresses in a special way. Oh, by the way, here is something that you can buy. Unfortunately, it's very expensive, but it does that. So I'll be furnishing all that information for the Wednesdays. But on the first and all the Van Halen albums, there's also going to be stuff like this is what they did with the drums and the bass in order to get that sound, because they had Ted Templeman, and he also did this with the Doobie Brothers, if I'm not mistaken. And Ted Templeman would do a thing where there would be a hole in the bass drum sound that specifically fit where the bass guitar would go. And he would assemble his sounds for like his rock, the Van Halen sound, the Doobie Brothers sound, anything like that. Part of his signature there would be assembling the sounds of the rock instrumentation so they fit together in a particular way. And then you've got like, old Rolling Stones, where you've got Bill Wyman with the Fender Mustang bass, which is a small bass that has a real sonority in the upper mid bass. And then a lot of the drums are sort of loose and rattly Charlie Watts, and this I read out of a book, was asked in the middle of tracking some of those classic hits. And there's a great book by Stanley Booth on the Rolling Stones, which gives you a perspective into the recording process. A guy in the recording sessions is acting like, so are you going to tune your drums? And Charlie's like, what? Tune your drums. Are you going to tune your drums? And Charlie Watts said, why would I tune something that I'm just going to beat on? I hit it a couple of times and it's going to change anyway. And so that tells you a lot. The Rolling Stones drum sound is not tuned drums. The Rolling Stone drum sound is a bunch of drums that are just sort of roughly tensioned to place in this sort of go thwap. There's this trashiness to them. And then they're not super, well, in some cases they are, like Shattered, for instance, is a good close mic'd kind of thing. But a lot of the older ones, like Beggar's Banquet, or even more than that, Let It Bleed. Let It Bleed has a lot of drum sounds that are very roomy, and the kick drum is this huge rumbling kind of jazz-like thing. There's a point on this wave of bass that boom punches you out, and it's the farthest cry from like modern close mic'd clicky kick drum type stuff, and it generates its own sound. So yeah, let me try to, I'm chasing this scroll back. I'll stay online until everybody is taken care of. So no, we're not alternating Mondays. You're getting an extra day if I get there. You get more when you give more. It just only makes sense. I wouldn't have it any other way. Plugins, Cojones is weird. Don't use Cojones if you want it to sound like a preamp simulation. It's just something different. You can experiment with it, but yeah. And never apologize. I scold you for apologizing to me. Don't apologize for me. Damn it. As far as I'm concerned, you guys can't do anything bad. Only thing that could happen is I'm like, no, I don't do that, or you've misunderstood that. But asking, like the scientific thing, if you're not getting it wrong some of the time, you're not trying hard enough. And I think with sound engineering and mixing and stuff, it's also like that. Like, if you're really worried about, like I did a mistake, then stop being worried about that, because it's really important to be able to try stuff that won't always work. A quick example, and something that I'm going to try to work on today, I think. Last couple of recordings I've done on the synthesizers have been using that little device, which runs a computer. And I'm not sure whether you can see it. Maybe you can. I don't think it's in, yeah, you can. The one with the little white spot there in the sliders. And that's just a Korg Nano control, controlling an axolotl, and I built the axolotl into that. If I can get money, I'm going to make a bunch of printed circuit boards that are literally holes of those shapes, so that people can get an axolotl circuit board thing, and then just bolt it on to the circuit board, do the minor soldering necessary, put in the jacks, and have one of those for themselves for cheaply. because you can get an Axolotl for like $70. It's a computer. It does all kinds of really cool things, and you can program it, and you can use it to run your, rack system or whatever, or build your own stuff and control those. And it's just not easy to work with. Like, people don't make boxes to put them in, and I really want to be able to make a production run of like, yeah, here, bolt your Axolotl to this thing, and now you can put it into your Eurorack system. You're welcome. Because it's that simple. You can even power it off of the Eurorack rails. I'm doing that. I don't have to do anything particularly fancy because its voltage regulators are able to handle it. So yeah, let's continue following this. Clatter filters. That's a very good resonant filter. Multiband up here. Multiband point. No, I haven't. It doesn't occur to me that that's something. I don't understand that concept very well. Like, it would be parallel, I think. And point makes more sense to me as a single unit. I don't really understand. Like, when you talk about multiband transient designers, I start losing my mind. And I'm like, why would you do such a thing? It's like multiband. I've made a multiband distortion, but generally that kind of stuff goes in places where I find them sort of abhorrent. I'm like, no, don't do those things. You're losing everything that like proper analog recording as it has existed had. And if you want to chop stuff up into a mangled mess, then use FFT and make it into an MP3 and you're done. If you want to lose all the coherency of the initial wavefront so that everything is just coming across like different bands and different behaviors and stuff, I think that should be done like in synthesizers. That should be the tone generation rather than changing other stuff into it. Watch how like my superfan David Pixley then promptly does that. And he does it with my own live streams just to teach me. He's a master troll sometimes. But yeah, I often say continue to bug me about stuff, and then often people will. Like, there's somebody who really, really wants something that's like a channel strip, except for that it has a special pan law thing that does panning but also delays the sides in different ways. I've talked about that. It's not really very central in how I do things, so there's never any personal reason for me to do those. And I often feel like if I don't love it, it's not going to come out as good as it would if it was a plugin that I was really excited about. Like, if I'm just doing stuff to order, it's like my little brother getting paid to do accounting software. It's like, I can do that. If I run out of ideas, I totally will. I'm happy to work for people. But if I have a backlog of stuff that I want to have out, it's hard to get the stuff that I don't think is a good idea out when it's me that has to do them. I struggle to do things that I think are a really bad idea when I've got stuff that I'm excited about. Like, I could do the channel strip with arbitrary things that don't make any sense to me with the pan thing, and it only works in stereo. Or I could do a multiband version of point in which they're in parallel just because if you do a series version of point, put two of the plugins there. The only reason for having a multiband version of point is either to have them in parallel or to do equalizers and separate things into separate things, and then you apply point to the different bands, quite literally. And point already has a frequency component in a sense. So maybe I could be talked into seeing that, but I'm looking at going back into the character plugins and the sources of console and doing a series of console plugins, incorporating that with the distinctions. Like, I can use what makes bus colors work, the dynamic section of it, on the way console works to apply things only to the way that console takes the space between the notes and alters them. I should be able to take the space between the notes and make it sound more like a specific console. And nobody's doing that. You would know if they were because you'd have to use it the way console is used. Nobody's doing that. I should be able to do that. I'm super unwilling to put that off to do a multiband point or pan pot. So we'll see. We'll see. One thing about it, I'm not going to run out of things to do. I'll always be able to just program more stuff, because even if I need to do all the character-based things in quick order and then tell people how to mix and match them, for instance, because you'll be able to do that too. I'll always get around to the other stuff. You just might have to be really, really patient. And you can bug me, but people are learning that that doesn't necessarily make anything happen. I'm sad about it. I wish that I could, but there's only so much that I can do. And, you know, my enthusiasm sometimes need to get free rein, because generally I'm really sure that, like, if I do that one, it's going to be amazing. If I do a multi-band point, you could do that in Blue Cat Patchwork. You can get third-party stuff to do that. It wouldn't be that hard. I mean, Blue Cat doesn't necessarily, I don't think they have something where you're automatically splitting stuff into bands and then processing on the bands, but Patchwork literally will let you do that. And all you'd have to do is equalize things into some distinct bands using any kind of equalizer you wanted. You could be using mine. And set them up the same way. And then apply your different points on the different bands, and then just take the raw output and mix it, and you're fine. So that is an alternate way to do any combination of that stuff. And I could make you a plugin that would do that without you having to have Blue Cat Patchwork, but you could be doing it with Blue Cat Patchwork. And if you're willing, no, actually you can't do a series. So never mind. I'm downplaying your idea if I'm saying you should just do it in series, because if you're doing a multi-band EQ point, you can't do that in series. So never mind. You are asking for something that can't be done with just point all by itself, but then Blue Cat Patchwork exists. So, Zen Robe, yeah. Honestly, if there was a kind of Buddhism in Mintu, it's the Zen more than anything else. So that's legit. And that's why I'm also, like, if I need a really lightweight clothing for streaming in summer because it gets stupid hot, and, you know, I'm poor, so I also don't have air conditioning, I'm going to try to invent a way to not roast myself to death in the summer, but it is going to be hot, so I'll be experiencing that. Sweaty Chris stream. Can I make a plugin to stimulate me? What I'm trying to do that every single time, man. Mixers. Add the audio and, well, that is what I'm doing with Console. Console is doing a thing where technically it's adding stuff together, because you always have to get down to that in one way or another. But, and averaging is adding. Think of it this way. If you're talking about averaging, you've got a bunch of different samples, and they're over time, and then you got a bunch of different tracks. Very irregular samples. So here's a bunch of tracks, here's a bunch of different samples. Tracks go like this, and the samples go like this. If you're averaging to get different tones, you're averaging these, meaning you're adding them together, you're summing. And then you're dividing by the number of ones that you have, giving you the same basic amplitude back out again. If you didn't do that, you could add them all together, and then it'll just be louder. If you're summing, you're going this way, and you're adding these together. And then if you need to gain stage them, you might end up having it amount to multiplying them by the number of tracks. But more often what's going to happen is, as if you were just getting a louder average this way, you're adding these together, and then you just stick with that. And that's what summing basically is. Now, you could do things like multiplying them with each other, but the output would become mostly silent and then occasionally impossibly loud. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to do things like that. You could average this way and this way, but then you could do that simply by putting an average on the bus. And then you're getting the average of these because you're summing them. And then the average of that by summing the end total. It doesn't matter really in which order you do it. You could be averaging it this way first, or you could be taking the mix, averaging that, and it's going to effectively be the same as averaging these and then averaging these and averaging these. Because in the long run, once you get to the end of it, it'll work the same. So, I mean, I'm trying to do more subtle, different, and novel ways of making mixers add the audio. That's how I get stuff like console. That's how I get, well, no, bus colors isn't that. Some of the things in bus colors are distinct and different, and some of it is just convolution. But, yeah, there's very much a point, but it's not necessarily easy to do. I'm doing my best with it. And hey, I'm not catching up. I'm trying to catch up. What would I recommend in terms of literature places to start learning? Get something that does a thing. Like, I'm thinking about doing yet another stream. Maybe that could be a really high level where I do a really crudely basic form of let's learn to program. Namely, I would like to get a little screen display, some kind of, mini TV or monitor kind of thing, and attach it to my old Apple IIe. Because I have a old Apple IIe. It's not one that I grew up with. I grew up on a Apple II Plus. I learned to program by first starting to do stuff in AppleSoft Basic. The Apple IIe that I've got, which I ran across it like years ago or something, I was like, this is cool. Then it looks like the one that I started on. Give it to me. I want that. And so now I have it, and I haven't really been using it, but it should still be fine. It's not in the moldy basement or anything. It's like upstairs. And it needs a monitor. And if I can get that set up, I can start doing streams where it's like, okay, watch me and we will together program something on the Apple IIe, and I'll show you how that happens. And I'll also talk about, like, this is how this works. This is how this is different from, say, programming in C in a more modern computer. But here are some of the general concepts. Because now I can program in AppleSoft Basic and in C. And you can also program the old Apple machines in assembly language. And that has its own points of interest. Because that's how you got, like, the video games on the Apples. And it doesn't really take that, like, Apple IIs have like 16 to 48K kilobytes of RAM. Like, you could type for a day and fill up the RAM, and literally fill up the RAM. You could do an entire program, and it would only take you like a day or two, and then the rest is sort of amending or altering it, because you can't really type that many words before you've run out of memory. It's really small. This thing is really small. And it's got a lot of fun stuff like different graphics modes and things. And that's amusing. That's like an old school. My brother, the computer programmer brother, was like, I would watch that stream. Because it's old stuff and old computers and how to refurbish it. And he did say that usually they edit it down to a very convenient thing. And my streaming doesn't get edited because it's streaming. But yeah, there's another possibility is I could start doing how to program in a very abstracted sense. Because one of the things about programming, and my brother Dan would agree with this and confirm this, is you need to learn the underlying concepts of it. Because if you just start like, how do I program a plugin in this graphic user, in Juice, the graphic user interface for these particular things, and you're learning this very specific technology that's going to end up being useless, and you might not be learning how programming actually works, like how the ideas actually work. So what I would recommend is start programming doing anything. If you're at all interested in video games, you should be jumping on something like the Godot engine, because it's not overcomplicated, because it's a simple open source project, so it stays fairly simple. And you'll learn how to look up the stuff you need to know. And you'll be able to do many things. Like I showed you that the old white iMac that's like 2 feet thick. And I'm very interested in finding out whether I can make Godot engine things and compile them to make standalone programs that could run on that old machine and do useful stuff or interesting things, because you can use something like a Godot engine as just like, okay, we're programming in this, it's scripting language that it has. It's fast enough to run a game. That means you could do just about anything else in terms of like interesting program to calculate this or show that or play with thus. And then run it wherever. And you've also got Unity Engine and Unreal Engine and, stuff like that. You don't necessarily have to focus only on how do I where's the instruction manual for letting me learn to program specifically plugins. That's not really what you want. What you want is to dive into it until you have some familiarity with the whole concept, because you're going to be dealing with stuff that is the same all the world over. All different kinds of computers, all different kinds of machines, all different kinds of systems, and the more different ones you do, the more they all start to make sense. And that is my advice. Start learning by starting to do it. In my conversations with my brother, driving to continue working on this house that we're selling, my mom's old house, and as folks know, my mom and dad died last year, so sometimes I'm rather distracted with my duties around cleaning up all that mess. But when we were driving down, one of the things that he was saying was he was sorry he went to school. He went to a very decent school like Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and he graduated with honors, and he felt like he'd wasted his time because he got the college degree and he got all of this thing and he didn't care about anything but programming. That was all. That was what he was going to do. And the time that he spent in classes doing stuff and being told stuff, he felt was time wasted because it was not time programming and experimenting and trying stuff. It's like riding a bicycle. There's no such thing as a college class for these are the parts of the bicycle. This is the way that you balance. It's like, no, you've got to start doing it. That's my brother's recommendation. And I can only underscore it. Like, find some way of making a program that you can do the things, type in the code, put an output, and it does something. Get to that point where you can make a working result. Because if you can make a working result, you can start dicking around with the bits in the middle of it, changing things, and then you're off and running. You have to start making something that does a thing. And, you hit the compile button or you run it or whatever, and it does the thing, and you can see what it does and change how it's doing it. You got to get to that point. I had to do that with plugins as well. I had to get to the point where it's like, oh, if I build this, it works, and it's an audio unit. And once I had that, I was off and running. The same thing for the VSTs. It's not like I was dawdling around going, I don't feel like making VSTs. I didn't know how until I got to that point where it's like, and you hit compile, and it's a VST plugin. Yay! Now I can start experimenting with code and putting these things into a DAW and listening to what they do. And that's what teaches me. Not going like, okay, where's the instructions for making a good analog model? And there's no instructions. You got to start just experimenting with the stuff. Yeah. I'm going to have to keep scrolling because I'm keeping on falling behind, which is fine. Old Stone Drums. Yeah, well, it's distant microphones. And he didn't wail on the cymbals all that much. And he didn't go to crashes all that often. And when he was playing on the hi-hat, he wasn't beating on the hi-hat. And it's the sort of older, darker hi-hat. It doesn't cut all that much. So that's part of Charlie Watts' sound. And it's a thing that I actually really appreciate. So my hi-hat is much brighter. I have a particular brand of hi-hat, a Nemesis, and Saluda Nemesis. And they are like police bright. They are very bright and glittery. And I do like that, but it does make them dominate. But I do also like the darker hats, the stuff that sits back in the mix, and it serves kind of a different purpose. So let's keep scrolling. Song that's overprocessed with FFT. Well, anime music sounds like that. So if you want to make stuff that sounds like a particular genre that uses that, that's what you do. We got a remark on crystalloid algae, because that's what CLA means, crystalloid algae. I do not know what the issue with the pan on SSL. Monocompatibility does have to do with that, but I don't know what he would be talking about. Vocaloid, yeah, multi-band compressor, yep. That is a way of going for things. I think that one of the problems with that, if you're making music very much by the book and you're just extruding stuff out and you're using, like, one of the reasons I'm turning against Logic and I want to teach myself Reaper and start using that. If I start making graphical user VSTs, I'll probably do that, leave audio units out because they're more difficult, and start working only with Reaper because that'll display them. But I'm not liking Logic because it demands that you use their loops and things. They're super into them. But if you're doing all of that and then you go with multi-band compressors for everything, all of your stuff is going to sound like everybody else. And there will be no capacity for like a fingerprint on it. It's not just like you're making the same choices. If I decided to play all that anime music with the Vocaloid and stuff, and I've done things like this at times. There was a really obscure thing that I did once that was like that. And you perform the parts like to a analog recording console. You record to 16-track tape. And so you're playing the anime music, but you're miking through a good pre and you're singing the thing that's supposed to sound like that. I did one once where it was a My Little Pony fan song, and it was I think Sunshine and Celery Stalks, if I'm not mistaken. It's back in the day when that stuff first started to hit fandom. There was a musician who was making songs in the style of a musician known as Pogo. And their way of doing things was very much that anime style, bouncy, fluffy stuff. And then they would edit up vocals like crazy. So the vocals would be like, but it would be edited out notes and the lyrics would make no sense at all. And so the lyrics would be gibberish, but they'd be sung in this really perky manner. And it would... So I did some of that. And if you try doing something like that, which I did, as just performances, it becomes really weird. It's bad. It was not good. This is a terrible song that I did. It was a strange monstrosity, but it's really different. It's really distinct. You won't have heard anything quite like it. And that's what happened every time people sat down in a recording studio in the 1960s and 70s when you couldn't do the easy way out. Everything had to be, like, the closest they could get was using like the Wrecking Crew, hauling in the same studio musicians that played in everything, and they were really good. And so what you got was not just completely genericness, you got the feel of like the LA band, because it was the same musicians, and they were playing stuff all very cleanly and pristinely and so on. And it was about as generic as you could get, but it was still a fingerprint. It was still a very specific sound. Like, you wouldn't get that sound off of other records. It's like Hal Blaine was about 40 of people's favorite drummers. You'd have all these different pop hits, and like, oh wow, I love the drummer on that Petula Clan, Hal Blaine. I love the drummer on the first Birds, Hal Blaine. I love the drummer on Simon and Garfunkel, Hal Blaine. It's like that. And these days, what you've got is loops. Sometimes they're really bad, but they're convenient. And then the multiband compression is going to be doing the same thing tonally to the mix of just squinching it into a way. So you can do that, but, I just discourage that. Okay, let me keep scrolling as much as I can. DSD recording. I think there is the capacity for DST to be a completely different kettle of fish than PCM, but that doesn't mean it's that much better. It's just a slight change in... Like, I'm quite happy with my 9624. The PCM at 96K at 24-bit, if you do it right, will get you there. DSD is just a rawer form of stuff, and often rawer forms have a way of being better. It's just a question of how much. And DSD is also odd because everything about it is... So, waveform. DSD is nothing but a whole series of like, okay, plus, minus, plus, minus. Are we making this, the waveform that is chasing this, go up faster and faster or not? Because we're managing the speed of the rate of change. So if you had it just all pluses, your DSD waveform would go, boop, and it would be gone. It would distort whatever, and you would never see it again. So instead, it starts to get this point where it's going past where it's supposed to go, and then it starts going down. So it curves, and then it would go down to infinity if you let it. But then it goes past this again, and then it's like, okay, start turning up. And so it starts turning up, and you do that, and you're winding up getting this thing that chases the waveform. That's what DSD does, is it's like ones and zeros, up or down, and it's chasing the waveform based on is it over or under. And what that does is it makes a bunch of noise up in the really high frequencies. As you can see, it's like all wiggly here. And the noise pattern is, when you talk about FFT or you talk about analyzing frequencies, what you get is, with DSD, you're not quantizing. You are not picking positions. And I'm going to do a pretty good job of explaining this. Quantizing is this. You're picking positions for it to be, and then working out like how you get it around that, how closely you can get to any one of those lines. DSD has none of this. DSD, you're only saying up, down, no more, no less. You know, it's like you're steering around this waveform. So if you stop it at any point, nothing tells you where you are. To know where you are, you have to know where you started like 30 minutes ago. That's how DSD works, is it's chasing this waveform. So if you cut it off, like you go, skronk, and we're editing to somewhere over here. Okay, so where do we start? There is no lines. It's just like, okay, we're here relative to what we did half an hour ago. That's like gigabytes upon gigabytes of data. And then if you're trying to assign a place, well, DSD never assigns a place. It starts at 0, and then the pluses and minuses are chasing this thing. So you can't edit it, because if you stopped it, where are you? You don't know. You can listen to it and it sounds like music, but if you edit it, there's no way of telling where you are. It never quantizes at all. It's always just chasing this sort of analog value. And that means that its error rate is always very high for high frequencies. It has really bad accuracy for frequencies over 20 kilohertz and stuff. And even way up there, it's like, it's kind of splashy. It'll be like excessively jittery around there. But the farther down you go in frequency and average out what it's been doing, the higher resolution you get. My vinyl dither works like that. It comes from an old dither that I had called 10.9s. And the vinyl dither uses a similar principle. It makes a lot of noise and sort of aggregates it into sputters. But it makes a lot of noise way up top. And then as you get down into really low frequencies, it starts to get better. DSD is like that to the nth degree. There's no quantization ever. The super high frequencies are incredibly noisy to the point where, you know, it is of some concern whether your amplifiers will like give you some distortion, like intermodulation or distortion or whatever, just because you're throwing this hash at it, you're throwing these highs at it. Personally, what I would do is just put a inductive choke on the output. So it's like, okay, you're going through a transformer, have a nice day, high frequencies, and they would not make it through, and everything would sound like lovely and warm. But as you go down to the low frequencies, you start getting extraordinary resolution. You know, like we're measuring things like 96 dB below full loudness for CDs, you know, on 144 for 24-bit or whatever it is. And then people get mad at me for trying to dither floating point, because floating point is like, you know, 300 dB down, 64-bit floating point is even farther. DSD is the same way. If you were going to measure the accuracy of like a 60 hertz bass note, it could be down like minus 400 dB or something like that, because if you're just averaging it out, it will end up being very high resolution. So as far as DSD recordings, those are my feelings on it, because there are some very special things about it. I'd love to have the opportunity to do recordings and distribute stuff like that, but it never really caught on because really good quality PCM gets near as damn it. And it's one of the reasons it didn't catch on is you can't manipulate it, you can't edit it, you can't do those things to it unless you're converting it into a PCM form, in which case then you have PCM, so why bother? And that is how that works. Panning techniques with Haas effect. I did not know that, but that is one possibility. If it turns out that there are SSL consoles that delay the channels, that would explain it, and that would be a reason why it wouldn't be monocompatible. So, confirmed, Bernie. Yeah, we're all the way back to the can we do different kinds of summing. Summing is an average, absolute average. A median is still going to involve addition. A median is just a different way of calculating things. There are certainly, I'll make a note of that. Maybe there's pay dirt there. I think this might even be, I think maybe Bo is the same person that I've gotten other ideas from, like Holt. So I'm taking note of that. So median of average? I think median literally is average, but then mean might be the thing. It's either median or mean. And we'll see what a filter is like using some of these other techniques, because that is quite doable. If at worst, it'll just take more processing, and our computers can handle that these days. You know, like we'll do a nice little high frequency roll off, which rather than taking the mean of the averaged points, it takes the median, and we'll see what that sounds like. That'll be interesting, because I don't think anybody's done that. Cool, cool. The new thing to try. Getting into programs. Yep, listen to Joe Kovan. We may not have IRC anymore, but if you have a problem, that's the thing. Don't ask, how do I learn this? Ask, I'm trying to do this, it ain't working. What's going wrong? Or what am I missing is always a good question. So yeah, but never go and ask like, how do I learn programming? Get some tools and start making results. Do whatever you've got to in order to be making results, and then start doing something. And then if the something that you're trying to do isn't coming out the way that you thought, that's when you start asking questions, because it's in a specific way, rather than the general way of how do I become the person that can do the thing. You don't ask that, you start trying to do the thing and go, why is my thing not going the way that I thought? And sometimes you can even discover new stuff doing that. Like there's nothing like it's like people in martial arts not wanting to fight an amateur, which is not really a thing, but there's an element of truth to it, because if you're very highly trained and you know how stuff is supposed to go, it can throw you when somebody comes and they're goofy and doing things that are unexpected. And in programming new stuff, it's even better that way, because you don't know that you're not supposed to do the thing because it doesn't make any sense. Like a lot of my dither stuff works that way. I'll do stuff, it'll produce good sounds, and then people will be tearing me to shreds because it's missing certain technical things that also need to be covered. But I didn't know about those things, so they didn't stop me. So I went and did the thing, and it was different, and there was something valuable about that differentness. Live streams in the Apple II. Yep, I'll see what I can do. Jokus Kavan is exactly right here. Good advice there. Continuing to scroll up. Godot Engine. Yep. I am playing with it, so I will have some familiarity. So you can bring questions about the Godot engine to me too. Bring them to the Monday chat, and if you're fooling around with that, it might be something that I know, or it might be something that I know how to look up or figure out. Logic. Yeah, logic allows you to run literally anything into a loop. Yes, you can make loops. They supply you with all these pre-made loops, and that's what I don't like. And I want to get new ways of using a DAW together that are much more like old school. Here's the continuous flow of music. Play something along with it and have it be included. That's what I want. Now, if it's new ways of arranging it or forming it or whatever, that'll be fun and exciting. But like I know how to make loops and things, and I'm looking for new ways of doing stuff like that. So, there's no limitations to using the loops. You can use the loops in all manner of ways, and I'm just looking for something else. I'm glad that you love my stories, because you get lots of them on Mondays. And there will be lots of stories about musicians and music history on Wednesdays when we get there. Mean is average. Okay, so it is median I'll be looking into. Thank you, computer musician. Very good. Mode. Oh, I should write that down too. Thank you, computer musician. I will make a note of that. Because I didn't think of that, because I don't use it very often. But if you had a waveform, and that's the thing, is you'd almost need to quantize in order to get mode, because literally all of the samples are going to be different most of the time. But there is a purpose to that, because there are situations where you would have a higher mode in some places, namely clipping. You can get a hardness in the sound out of having audio where there's a lot of clipping, so stuff goes to one place and then stops often. And if you measured it, you would have a much greater mode on those samples, and it would be an undesirable condition. So you could do a thing where you were scanning for that and then trying to reassign them in some way, because they were happening too frequently and there wasn't supposed to be any consistency to the samples. Because I think that is the thing. It's like mode is most frequent. Or I'll highlight it. Yes, mode is most frequent, but as far as audio and listening is concerned, our ears don't like hearing that. Our ears would prefer to hear stuff where there is no most frequent sample that is occurring, because it's all very unpredictable. And that gets into the evergreen stuff that I'll be talking about on Wednesdays when that happens. Yep. Yeah, mean and median is not the same thing. I have looked up that enough to know what that is about. Median is the one to experiment with, really. How to live as a kind human in this world. Pretty much when I start talking about the economics things or whatever, it's going to lead to that, because the situation that we're in is one where the mechanics of society, the mechanics of economics are forcing people in directions that they wouldn't necessarily want to go. They perceive it as being their survival, that in order to survive, they must do thus and so. Like back with the McDonald's things that I started out talking about. Like McDonald's feels like, well, for our survival, we're going to have to work out better ways of making kiosks so that we don't have to employ people, and be able to make the people order stuff more conveniently, and, just do all of that stuff I talked about that seemed negative in terms of employees being able to survive. And McDonald's will be like, well, we have to do this because otherwise Wendy's will eat our lunch, or people will stop wanting to do fast food, which has been happening. And in order to continue being McDonald's, we must do the thing. Because when you're in a context that is not controlled, and it's going in negative directions, and there isn't any overlying structure that says this is how the world works. You don't behave like this, you pay people a living wage, and because they're people and stuff. And usually it doesn't come down to just raw logic. It comes down to values and ethics and stuff like, people are these things that walk around and flip burgers or think ideas or make live streams. And because they do these things, you should respect and value them. And there's a lot of situations in the world that are like, no, you shouldn't. They're ants. They're just as worthless as ants or termites. You might need to exterminate some of them. You might need to just have them stay over there, and then you're doing your thing over here. There is no technological argument to the value of humans. Here's a good thing to watch. Like, if you've ever heard of the YouTuber CGP Grey, go and look up CGP Grey's video called Humans Need Not Apply. And in that, he outlines one perspective. And it is only one perspective, but he outlines it very well. He makes a compelling case of, if you're just being logical about it, we should all just blow up and go away. Because now that we've reached computers and stuff and things are being automated, increasingly we're going to a place where we aren't needed at all for anything, ever. And it's only going to get worse. So it becomes a moral question, and you don't answer moral questions by pragmatic, logical means. Instead, you decide, like, this is how the world works, and what values would I like to propagate through this world? So, yeah. So, a little more talk about the median and mode. I have enough to go on with, so that's good. I could be looking at slew rates for modes. Probably what I need to do is learn how to quantize slew rates. Then we can see what that sounds like too. I'll write that down. Because we have a better chance of getting useful stuff going on by quantizing slew rates, because they're more likely to be consistent, even though there's still going to be first I have to learn how to quantize them and bit crush them. And then I have to learn how to measure the mode, because once I bit crush them, there will be fewer of them. And then I can do weird things with that, which may or may not become a thing. I'm not sure whether that's going to happen. But yeah, so we're talking about labor and stuff, and that's interesting. You know, there are other folks like if you like that kind of talk, I can direct you to some other people. There is a man, turns out it's a young man, he doesn't sound like it, going by Do Not Eat 001 or Do Not Eat 001. I'll even type that for you because I think I've got it right. I think it's this guy. And what he is doing is making YouTube streams and videos, not very frequently, but he's got a bunch of them and he's making more. And he is doing sort of social analysis, you know, and class analysis. He's coming from a, I'm not sure if you'd call it a hardcore communist framework or a socialist framework, but he's coming from this perspective where he analyzes things and makes them explicable to people, and you can kind of understand where he's coming from and what he's saying. And it's touching on that moral concept, and he's illustrating them in City Skylines, the city builder game City Skylines. So what he'll do is he'll talk about highway development. And there's a specific video in which he's doing exactly that. Oh, hang on a second. There's a technical question. Would you like to be told about slew and audio? Because I know all about that, because that's one of the things that I've been programming from a long time. So here's a waveform. You probably know the waveform. Slew rate at any given moment is how fast it's going in this direction from one sample to the next. So if we've got this waveform, our slew rate from here is like next to nothing. Our slew rate from here to here is like this. So it's this much. And then from here to here, it was this much. And as we get higher up, our slew rate becomes this much. I'm not drawing it very well, but that's because I'm drawing on the opposite side of the paper for the camera. And then as we get here, our slew rate becomes this much, but it's down instead of up. That's slew rate. Slew rate is the difference in position between two sample points. And the samples are not literally the waveform, but the slew rate is the difference between the two sample points, which themselves are used to reconstruct a waveform. If it's really flat or it's really little amounts of change, it's probably very close to the samples. Yes, in discrete audio, it is indeed the instantaneous rate of change. So that should give you a good start on the slew rate thing. And a lot of my plugins make use of this property because you can measure it separately. You just keep the previous sample, subtract it, and then you've got that number to work with. And it's a good way of doing the Wednesday analysis things also use slew rate as part of their measurements. So, and of course, as you might imagine, slew rate correlates very closely with how much brightness, how much treble is in the sound. Because if you've got a waveform and it's got a bunch of really high frequency noises that just make these large sudden motions rather than low frequency noises that change very gradually, these are really high slew rate. Like from one point to the other point is a big change. So if you have high slew rate, either you have impossibly loud sounds or impossibly bright sounds. And if you have high slew rate relative to the overall amplitude of the sound, it's always going to be a bright sound. It's always going to be high frequencies. How's that? And yep, Bo is correct. Manual labor, the cost of it goes up simply because it's trying to compete against the cost of automation, which goes down kind of infinitely. And indeed, that is the agricultural to industrial shift. And this is another one much like that. So, and you know, there's another fellow. I'll type this in as well while I'm here. It's one, but I'm just finishing up. If you're interested in a modern American capitalist Ivy League college-educated radical, rather than just going to obscure YouTubers playing video games and being communists, you should be looking at Mark Blyth instead. Do Not Eat is awesome, and he's worth listening to, and he'll talk about things like making highways, and you'll plan highways and city skylines, but he'll start with like a more rural setup, and then he'll be taking the little bulldozer thing and start destroying the properties that the highway must go over, and then it will tell you a little story he's making up about like this person lived in here and they were like this and they had a cat and so on, and now they're homeless, too bad, sorry, and he'll smash the building and move on to the next one and tell you a story about the next person underneath where the highway is to go. So he has this very political edge on all of that kind of stuff. He sounds like an old civil engineer, but he's actually a young man, and those videos are really good. Now, Mark Blyth, by contrast, is an old man, and I'm sure he'd be first to tell you this. He is this Scottish college professor, and is a naturalized American. He came from Scotland. He became an Ivy League college professor of economics because he grew up poor in England, and there was a welfare state, and his family, CGP, not PG, CGP, Gray. He used a welfare state, and he considers that the UK government got much more than it spent on him in the welfare system, except for nope, because he migrated to the US, and so now the US gets to levy taxation on his Ivy League Brown University professor salary. And he's doing really well for himself, but he is just as much a leftist radical, and he was also a stand-up comedian at one point, so he is capable of being really funny and engaging. He is good to listen to. And Mark Blyth has a very, very sharp analysis of everything that's been going on in recent years. You know, everything that's been going on since the dawn of neoliberalism. and strongly recommended. I follow that guy closely. Interestingly, one of the things that he had to say is he's not worried about automation. Mark Blythe is not worried about automation, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, he feels like every time we invent new things like this, we invent more need for people to manage them and get good at them. So as far as he's concerned, the idea of like everybody learn to code is kind of true because people will start doing more with coding and there'll be a lot more use for that. But he also is aware of the fact that, the globe is experiencing temperature issues and stuff, and much things need to be done in order to stop us from basically drowning entire countries and flooding all of Florida and all that kind of stuff, which is, we're on the glide path to that. And he considers that that is going to become a big enough problem, how to handle that, how to handle relocating entire countries with the people, how to handle building housing for tens and hundreds of thousands of migrants, how to handle setting up all of the deal like there. Basically what you do is you take them in and tax them. So that's kind of where money comes from for that sort of thing. It doesn't really work that you take in migrants and then you're just feeding them like they're pets. No, they become part of the economy. They spend money. And they spend money in the country in which they live. So Blythe thinks that there is going to be huge necessity for a huge number of people working really hard in every imaginable, like there's going to be people who need to build levees, like literally build levees by either shoveling stuff or running power shovels or whatever it is that they need to do, because we're going to need to have dams and levees and things to ward off the results of flooding and all this kind of stuff. So Blythe does not think it is a problem that everything is being automated, because there will be further things for people to do, and it kind of expands outwards. We manufacture new stuff. It's much like when you build new roads, you get new traffic that fills up the new road. And Do Not Eat 001 would be telling you that. He would be telling you like, yeah, well, you can build the highways, and the thing is, it's not really a good solution, because when you build the highways, you have immediately filled the highway. And what he's leaving unstated is that you have more economic activity going on because of the highway being there, and that's what's filling it. It all kind of gets tangled together. But in any case, that is getting far off of the subject of plugins in audio. So we will have plenty of time to talk about this in future, because these problems are not going away anytime soon. But for now, what I'm going to do is let my eyes reflect these screens so that I look all weird. And what I'm going to do is go off and deal with these phone and computer issues and some of this new stuff. And I will try to remember to set the samples and things and the recordings to the correct frequency now, so that I don't ruin another music jam. And I'm going to try to change that music jam thing over there so that rather than combining, I'm trying to run two sequences at the same time. It is a key changer. It changes the key for my live music jams, and then all the sequencers go along with that. And it can do that in many different ways. But what I've got it doing right now is doing two separate sequences, and what it ends up producing is gibberish, in that it's trying to follow the sequence, and I wanted to make it so that it would stay on some notes longer and then hit some notes shorter, but all it did was create chaos and randomness. So it'll use the pitches that I programmed into the sequencer, but you can't predict them. So what ends up happening is just gibberish. And my jams recently have been colored by that. Like I've been picking fairly dissonant notes and then just kind of shredding musical nonsense. And people don't really like it when I do that. So I'll be trying to work on that and get something that is a little more consistent or a little more predictable, and then rely on, somewhat more musical repeating things. I'm gonna figure out a way to get stuff that is a little more predictable and go with that. So on that note, and I promise I'll have a look at Reaper. I'll figure out something to do with that. Maybe not by next week, but we'll see. On that note, I will talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.